Good evening. It is 7:30 and therefore it is time to start the 5th annual Iona Campagnola Lecture in Restorative Justice. Thank you for coming. To welcome you on behalf of North Island College, I would call upon President John Bowman.
Yes, thank you, Bruce. Wow. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of everyone at North Island College, welcome to the Comox Valley campus and the Stanhagen Theatre. It's indeed a pleasure to welcome you to the 5th annual Iona Campagnola Lecture in Restorative Justice. We're very proud that this lecture series is co-presented by the Community Justice Center and North Island. And I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the great work that Bruce Curtis and the board of the CJC and the many professionals across our region and community who work in restorative justice do. Let's give them all a big round of applause, please. Their efforts are truly making our communities an even better place to live and to work. I must say also, this is a really impressive attendance. I understand that we're sold out tonight, and thank you all again for being here. Of course, seated among you are many dignitaries, elected officials, and special guests. I learned some time ago that it's not a good idea to try to introduce people because you inevitably forget someone, but just all of you who hold elective office and special positions, consider yourselves acknowledged and recognized. Let's thank them for being here. I do also want to just take a moment to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional territory of the Comox First Nation. We appreciate very much at North Island College the positive working relationships and the hospitality we have with all of the First Nations in the North Island, and especially the Comox people. I think it's worth mentioning that, of course, the Campagnola Lecture Series are named in honor of the patron of the Comox Community Justice Center, Iona Campagnola. And the mandate is to bring to the Comox Valley the leading thinkers in the development and promotion of restorative justice as a preferred means of coming together to make things right. I'm going to say that again. Coming together to make things right. That is a tremendous inspirational mandate, and I thank you again, Bruce, and everyone who's involved in that. Previous lectures, as you probably know, have included the inaugural lecture was given by Professor Brenda Morrison, Director of the SFU Center for Restorative Justice. Judge Barry Stewart of the Territorial Court of the Yukon also presented. The Honorable Judge Ross Green of the Provincial Court of Saskatchewan presented. And just last year, we were honored to have the Right Honorable Beverly McLaughlin, Chief Justice of Canada, speaking to us. So this evening, we are delighted to have Svend Robinson, the 5th in the series, and I know that we can look forward to a very informative and engaging presentation. And I just want to take a moment before I leave the microphone to express my personal thanks to Svend and on behalf of all LGBT Canadians for his leadership and inspiration over the last many years, decades of his public service to Canada. Svend, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, President Bowman. You've taken care of one of the next tasks, which was the Aboriginal Acknowledgement, and I appreciate that. Melinda Knox from the Comox First Nation was originally scheduled to be here, but unfortunately the Minister of Health called her into a hospital to have a procedure that she's been waiting for a year and a half for. So she was delighted to attend the hospital and regrets that she's not able to attend this evening to extend her welcome on behalf of the Comox First Nation. I'd now like to call to the podium the Comox Valley Community Justice Center Vice President, Tyler Voigt, to do a welcome on behalf of the CJC. He, of course, is the Vice President, so he's a heartbeat away from the President. The President, unfortunately, is out of town today from a previously scheduled event before this date was set. So she sends her regrets at not being here, Ann Davis from the Women's Transition Society, and I welcome Vice President Tyler Voigt.
It is my honor, on behalf of our President, Ann Davis, to welcome you to the Campagnola Lecture on Restorative Justice this evening. The lecture was established by the Community Justice Center in celebration of our patron's 80th birthday. It draws to the Comox Valley some of the leading practitioners, scholars, and thinkers on the closely related issues of restorative justice practice and building a better, more humane, indeed, a more civil and inclusive community. The stature of the speakers who have accepted the invitation to become our Campagnola lecturer is a testament to the qualities of our patron, the Honorable Iona Campagnola, and the reputation of the Community Justice Center. This year's speaker is no exception. He comes to us this year between last year's lecturer, the Chief Justice of Canada, the Right Honorable Beverly McLaughlin, and the 2017 lecturers, the Right Honorable Adrienne Clarkson, former Governor General of Canada, and her husband, Dr. John Ralston Saul, past president of PEN International, the world's oldest human rights organization, very august company. The Campagnola lecturers are part of the Community Justice Center's public education program, promoting the expanding adoption of the practices of restorative justice in a wide variety of contexts. This year, we are focusing on examining the role of restorative justice and healing at the intersection of crime and mental health. On behalf of the Board of Directors and volunteers and the staff of the Community Justice Center, welcome to the 5th Annual Campagnola Lecture.
To introduce tonight's speaker, we call upon our patron, the Honorable Iona Campagnola, patron of the Community Justice Center, to do the introduction.
Thank you. It'll take a minute to get this. Thanks to my friend Mike Hendren and his wife Dove Hendren who brought me here tonight. Well, President Bowman, North Island College representatives, honored speaker, Svend Robinson, Mr. Riveron, I too acknowledge with respect the Comox First Nation in whose traditional territories we are gathered on this occasion. Your Worships, Councillor, Regional District Representative, 19 Wing Acting Wing Commander, Officer in Charge, Comox RCMP, Vice Chair, Taylor Voigt, board members, and Executive Director, Bruce Curtis. See, you can do it. I am delighted to be with you this evening and to introduce Svend Robinson, whom I've known for a very long time. I think I first saw him at a Greenpeace rally long ago. Svend has been active in many issues over his lifetime. During his university days, he was active in student politics at UBC Academic Senate. Ultimately, he became the first student elected to the Board of Governors. Following graduation from UBC Law faculty in 1976, he studied at the London School of Economics, and then he articled to be admitted to the BC Bar in 1978. I remember March of 1979. A long-delayed federal action was called. Pauline Jewett, the first woman president of SFU, was running against a rather unknown young man for the nomination for the NDP in Burnaby. Parliament had been dissolved, and the resulting election brought a few surprises. The Progressive Conservative Party and its leader Joe Clark, Canada's youngest ever PM, had defeated Pierre Trudeau and the Liberal Party, which were to be re-elected the following year. I lost Skeena riding in 1979 to the NDP's Jim Fulton and 3 other candidates by 610 votes. Svend Robinson, however, was elected as MP for Burnaby, and a period of continuous service of 25 years in the House of Commons until 2004, when he resigned. Over the course of his career, Mr. Robinson has steadily pursued what he sees as a just relationship between people, places, ideas, and governments. He advocated for environmental protection and was among participant protesters on Haida Gwaii and in Clayoquot Sound. Those protests were always with the invitation of, or the collaboration of, the First Nations in whose traditional territories such actions took place. The blockade at Untitled Chapter, Lyle Island, against forest operations there was in support of the Haida Nation. The subsequent sight of dignified elders being led away by mounted police officers proved to be a catalyst in helping establish Gwaii National Park on Moresby Island. Also, after years of work by the entire community, Kale Nagai, the splendid Haida Heritage Sea Lion House Museum, composed of 7 longhouses, was developed near Skidegate. At that time, charges were laid against protesters, including Svend. Results included considerable reduction in the BC government's planned authorization of old-growth logging in the Clayoquot watershed. The resulting interim measures agreement with the affected First Nations led to the preservation of substantial old-growth temperate rainforest and the creation of the Clayoquot Sound UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. Mr. Robinson was also among the hundreds of those who participated in the Clayoquot Biosphere Reserve blockade. In referencing both Haida Gwaii and Clayoquot blockades, Justice Wally Opal observed that such civil disobedience, like that of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, has been instrumental for many great human purposes. We all remember, particularly now, I think, Mr. Robinson's role in the right to physician-assisted death. He was a friend and advocate of the late Sue Rodriguez, who died on February 12, 1994. In his media interview following the event, Svend was questioned about his role as a member of Parliament and his duty to uphold the law, and he said, "The highest duty of any member of Parliament is love." The Rodriguez case has been a consideration in the Supreme Court judgment, which last year ruled that such services are to be legalized and mandated across the country this year. Mr. Robinson was the first Canadian MP to come out as being gay. On Leap Day, February 29, 1988, his actions encouraged others to follow his example. He sought to protect gay rights and LGBTQ rights. In this, he did in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, though, in 1991. And although he was unsuccessful at that time, in 1995, the Supreme Court read sexual orientation rights into the Charter. Ultimately, pension rights were won for same-sex couples. In 1988, discrimination against gays and lesbians in the Canadian military was abolished. And finally, the Supreme Court ordered that same-sex couples could legally marry. His private member's bill, C-250, was not only passed by the House of Commons, but also the Senate, and was given royal assent in 2004. Sexual orientation was added to the grounds in the criminal code relating to the promotion of genocide and public incitement to hatred. These actions helped pave the way for his own quiet wedding to Max Riveron in 2007. Mr. Robinson now works for the Global Fund to Fight Malaria, Tuberculosis, and AIDS, based in Geneva. As Senior Specialist for Parliamentary Affairs, he is responsible for relations with the legislatures of donor and recipient nations. The fund has generated some $22 million in the decade between 2002 and 2011. The Global Fund, founded by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and Microsoft's Bill Gates, is now recognized as one of the most effective and reputable international agencies working to bring healing to some of the most vulnerable populations in the world. These are some of the highlights of Mr. Robinson's extraordinary career of adopting a set of political views that were ahead of his time. Many of those views have now become standard in Canada. He's worked in the areas of progressive social change all his life and has personally incorporated restorative justice into his own life when the occasions called for it. On behalf of the Community Justice Center at North Island College, we welcome the Senior Specialist for Parliamentary Affairs at the Global Fund, Fighting Malaria, Tuberculosis, and AIDS, for a lecture that he has titled Broken Minds and Broken Laws, Restoration and Justice. It's a pleasure to introduce Svend Robinson.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Iona. And like others, I want to acknowledge with respect that we are on the traditional lands of the Comox nation. The Africans have a great tradition when they're in the presence of many distinguished guests of, instead of singling them out by name, saying all protocols observed. And we have just a wonderful group of people here, and I want to acknowledge all of you and thank you for being here. And Iona, to particularly thank you for that wonderful and very moving introduction. What a great privilege to be introduced by a woman for whom I've had such great respect and admiration for many years. And to have been invited to be a part of this lecture series named in honor of Iona. And if I can say, to be in between, as was mentioned, I mean, Beverly McLaughlin and Adrian Clarkson. I said to Max, what am I doing here? You know, it's such a great privilege to be here, to follow in the footsteps of the remarkable Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin. I took the opportunity to see her lecture. And it was really an amazing event, and I was so glad that she was able to share her wisdom with you as part of this lecture series. Iona and I actually have a few things in common. Iona is a proud daughter of Galiano Island, and Max and I for many years have had a place on Galiano Island. It's a special, wonderful place, and I believe that Iona's grandfather actually built the community hall on Galiano, if I'm not mistaken, and Galiano folks are very, very proud of that connection. We also share a few common experiences over the years. Iona didn't mention, but actually in the 1984 federal election, we were candidates side by side. Iona ran in North Vancouver, Burnaby, and I ran in Burnaby. And Iona, I had huge respect for her. I know I've been a New Democrat since I was a kid, but the New Democrats didn't have much of a chance in that riding, and you can imagine who I was secretly pulling for. And it wasn't always so secret. We had a couple of conversations because Iona and I were also honorary directors of something called CAROL, the Canadian Abortion Rights Action League. We were honorary directors, and those were the early 80s. And, you know, this was still pretty controversial, wasn't it? We got a fair amount of abuse. The first bill I tabled in the House of Commons actually was a bill to take abortion out of the criminal code, and God knows I have the scars from that one. But and so as Iona says, so does she. And I don't know if you remember, but in that 84 election, Iona, both of us were targeted during the election by a guy who came out from Manitoba named Joe Borowski, who demonstrated first outside your office and then outside my office, to no avail whatsoever. But it was great to see Iona strong and principled and a fierce defender of human rights and freedom of choice on abortion, back in days when it wasn't always easy within your own party either. I know that. And then Iona mentioned Haida Gwaii. We both had the honor of having been invited to join the Haida Nation, the Haida family. I was adopted and given the name White Swan after the Lyle Island protests. And Iona was given the honorific, and it really was just a great honorific, of a name, and I can't pronounce the name in Haida, I'm sorry, but it means person who sits high. And so we share that family, that Haida family, and that's very precious. And I know, and Iona, I hope you know this as well, that the love and respect that you still have in Haida Gwaii is incredible. People will never forget your leadership on behalf of the people of that community. So wonderful to be here tonight, and thank you for that introduction. And of course, thanks as well to those who made this lecture possible tonight. We're on the land of North Island College, and John, thank you for being here, and the college for co-sponsoring the event. And particularly, of course, the Community Justice Center. To Bruce, your board, your dedicated team of community partners and volunteer staff, and I think over 150 volunteers, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, in a small community like Comox Valley, that's extraordinary. Making a remarkable difference, and really national leaders in the restorative justice movement. Absolutely no question about that. And in fact, I was really pleased to see that, Bruce, you were honored not that long ago with one of the top tributes in the restorative justice field, the Hummingbird Award from Simon Fraser University for your national leadership. When I think of the contribution of the CJC, I'm reminded of the words of Margaret Mead. And when I was a member, these were sort of my favorite words because they were empowering words and they were so relevant to so many different contexts. But I think they're particularly relevant in the context of the CJC. She said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And you're changing the world here in a very important and profound way in the Comox Valley. And I thank you for that. I might say as well, it's really nice to be back in the Comox Valley. I've been in Europe, living in Europe for quite a few years now. But when I was a boy, young boy, my family used to love camping. And our favorite campground was at Miracle Beach, not far from here. It's just a beautiful, beautiful area. I wish I had the time to visit there, but I will be back. Many happy memories. And it's great as I look out to see so many old friends here tonight as well. People that I haven't seen for many years. People like Bruce and Evie. I mean, Evie and I were involved in student politics at UBC. I think I managed your first campaign for public office at UBC about 40 years ago, something like that. Steve Bogus, my friend Catherine Bell, and her partner Roger. Catherine, who was really a fine member of Parliament for too short a period of time, but from 2006 to 2008, but really made her mark on the country then. And of course, my old friends, Colin Gableman and Robin Geary. How far back we go, I'm not going to give you the details. But Colin was really, and sometimes people forget this, but Colin was a truly outstanding Attorney General for British Columbia. He was the Attorney General under Premier Mike Harcourt from, I believe it was 1991 to 1995. Now, he was a great Attorney General. I have to make a confession here in Colin's presence. I know I didn't always make Colin's life easy. In fact, twice he had to appoint independent special prosecutors to report on my conduct. It's true. Once following the death of my dear friend that Iona mentioned, Sue Rodriguez, who led the fight for the right to die with dignity in Canada with such incredible courage and dignity and dedication until her death in February of 1994. And then once again, a special prosecutor was appointed after I participated in the peaceful civil disobedience at Clayoquot Sound at the Kennedy Lake Bridge, along with some 800 other people in the summer of 1993 to try to do what we could to save the magnificent old-growth forest of Clayoquot Sound. On Sue Rodriguez, you will understand, and Iona, I was really glad you made reference to this, how absolutely thrilled I was with the recent decision of the Supreme Court of Canada to effectively reverse their earlier decision, the earlier decision of the court, and to uphold the request that Sue Rodriguez had made over 22 years ago when the decision was handed down. Well, there was one judge who was actually part of that bench in 1993 that dissented from the majority. And that judge was Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin. And how wonderful it was that it was the Chief Justice who wrote the decision, the unanimous decision, all these years later, now in a majority in support of that fundamental charter right. It was a proud day for all Canadians. I might say that I'm going to be reading with interest, and I hope some of you will as well, the report that was just released today by the Special Parliamentary Committee that was appointed to make recommendations to the government as how to proceed on this really important issue. I've been asked to share with you this evening something of my own story, my own journey, to help understand the links between mental illness and restorative justice. Broken minds and broken laws. How do these intersect? And what lessons can we perhaps learn from these experiences? Let me readily admit that preparing for this night has not been easy. And I think you'll understand that. Reliving the painful events of April of 2004, over a decade ago, yes, but still very raw in some respects. Going through the old press clippings and letters and stored memories. But I hope that by sharing some of these reflections, that my journey might help to make the path easier for others who face similar challenges, albeit not all necessarily in quite so public a way as I did, in the full glare of the national media. And boy, I mean, looking back over some of those stories, I just thought, my God, it was pretty tough. It was pretty painful. The other thing I should tell you, by the way, is that it was a bit difficult when Bruce first contacted me about giving the lecture. I mean, immediately I felt humbled and honored when I realized the company I was in, but also, while I was pretty active in public life and politics for a quarter of a century, I've been in Europe for almost the last decade, and this is the first opportunity that I have to speak publicly in Canada for almost a decade. So if I'm a little rusty, you will understand, but for me it feels like a real privilege and honor to be able to share some thoughts with you. You've heard that I had that rare privilege of being able to serve as a federal member of Parliament for over 25 years, from 1979 to 2004. And over those years, I actually did have the many opportunities to address issues of mental health and mental illness. First, as a member of the historic committee that wrote the Constitution of Canada, appointed by Pierre Trudeau back in 1980, 1981. I was just a new member of Parliament at the time. But I was appointed to the committee, and it was the committee that wrote our Constitution. And the Constitution did not originally include in the Charter of Rights a provision for respecting the rights of people with physical and mental disabilities. But we heard very powerful and compelling evidence at the committee, and it moved the committee. And in fact, we included in our charter, a lot of people don't know that it's in the charter, but we included a specific provision to protect and affirm the equality rights of people living with physical and mental disabilities. We're the only country in the world that actually has entrenched that in our Constitution, and that's a good thing. That section of the Charter, Section 15, came into force in April of 1985, over 30 years ago now, and that year I was appointed to another parliamentary committee. This time it was a Conservative government, John Crosbie, that appointed a small committee to say, what does this mean? What does this Charter of Rights mean, and what laws do we have to change? And as part of our report, once again, we made some very strong recommendations around respect for people living with mental illness, understanding and accepting people. And the report dealt with some of the fear and the stereotypical responses to people living with mental illness and made a number of recommendations for changes. Also, I was in the 1980s, for almost that full decade, I was the justice spokesperson. I was the critic for the party, for the New Democrats on justice issues. And I was confronted over and over again with a failure of our criminal justice system to respond in an appropriate way to mental health issues, particularly those faced by youth and Aboriginal peoples. The absence of leadership on those issues, which I also witnessed firsthand, by the way, when I did a brief term of imprisonment myself for 2 weeks after the peaceful civil disobedience in Clayoquot Sound. It was Judge Wally Opal that sentenced me, in fact. He said it was the hardest sentencing he'd ever had to do. I'm not sure what to take of that, but it was not easy. And then they offered to let me have the electronic bracelet. But I said, if grandmothers are going to prison for Clayoquot Sound, I'm not going to wear a bracelet. And I also thought I could do a bit of research at the time, right? So I did. My first assignment was to paint an outhouse, and I did a fine job of that. Painted it bright green, but I took that opportunity when I was there to meet with prisoners, to meet with guards, and to hear of the staggering number of people who were struggling with issues such as substance abuse, addictions, illiteracy, learning disabilities, and yes, of course, mental illness. Many from a very early age, and almost all systematically ignored, too often leading to suicide and attempted suicide. The grim reality is that 30% of the people who live with mental illness only get psychiatric treatment after they've had a run-in with the law. They didn't know that they were living with it. And it was only that run-in with the law which forced them to confront their own illness. And indeed, as you will hear, that was my own personal experience as well. I also dealt in the 80s with one of the toughest issues of ethical breakdown in mental health in Canada, when I worked hard for justice and compensation for the victims of CIA brainwashing experience at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. I don't know how many of you remember that story, but it was really a shocking story. First, they were victims of the Allen Memorial experiments, but then victims of their own government, which failed to accept any responsibility. People like Linda MacDonald and Val Orlico, who sought help for depression from Dr. Ewan Cameron, and instead were made into human guinea pigs for the CIA-funded experiments of Dr. Cameron. And they were scarred for life. There was a very moving CBC film that was made, and I was involved in the production of that film by a woman named Anne Wheeler. It was called The Sleep Room. And of course, often in my work as a member of Parliament, in my constituency, and those of you that are elected representatives, even at the local level, I know, will understand and share this experience. I dealt with constituents, and Iona, you would have had the same experience, dealt with constituents. Catherine, you would have had this in your experience as well, Evie and other elected folks, Colin. the experience of dealing with constituents and families who were living with mental illness. One of them I remember most vividly was a young guy named Matt. And it was kind of an interesting story. He said to my constituency assistant, look, I want to meet Mr. Robinson, but it's very confidential. And so he came and closed the door behind him and said, you know, I've got something I really have to share with you, Mr. Robinson, right? And I thought, you know, a lot of young gay guys had to sort of, you know, felt they could trust me, so he's going to come out, right? And he said, I've got something I have to tell you. I have to share something about my life. And I said, it's okay, you can trust me, you know, I understand these things. And he said, well, actually, he said, I'm schizophrenic. I'm living with schizophrenia. And I want to help to educate the people in Burnaby about what this means for me and for my family. His name was Matt. And he was an amazing guy. I worked with him. We held a series of public forums in different parts of the constituency. He wrote articles for the local newspaper, and he came out, in a sense, as a person living with mental illness. And it really helped to open my eyes. And in fact, the more I thought about it after meeting with Matt, especially after kind of that initial reaction, the more I was struck by the many parallels between the stigma and the discrimination that's faced by gay and lesbian people historically, and that confronted by people living with mental illness. The cruel and inaccurate stereotypes in the media and in the public. As a young gay man growing up, the only images that I saw of gay people were either suicidal or homicidal. Nothing positive, nothing affirming. Gays were a threat to our children. AIDS was God's punishment for this curse that I was born with. And as we all know so well, too often the images of people living with mental illness today are still overwhelmingly negative. Either they are homicidal maniacs or they are vulnerable childlike figures who must be protected. A content analysis of American television shows a while ago showed that over 70% of major characters on television with a mental illness in primetime shows are portrayed as violent, and more than a fifth are shown as deranged killers. These are the images that people have of people living with mental illness. Despite the fact, and Health Canada and many others have documented this, that there is no compelling scientific evidence to suggest that mental illness causes violence at all. Even the language we use is problematic in many cases. And it wasn't until 2014, for example, that in Nova Scotia they repealed the Insane Persons Act. So, you know, language and words are powerful. In addition to the stigma of stereotyping, which is shared by gays and lesbians and people living with mental illness, there was the absence of human rights protection. The right to the security of a home, a job, basic community services. Until not that long ago, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation was accepted in all of these areas. Fortunately, that's no longer the case, but that wasn't always the case. And sadly, many of these are the same areas in which there exist huge barriers today for people living with mental illness. I was speaking earlier with Natasha, a psychiatrist from the community, who was talking about the really important work that she was able to do in helping to heal people who came to her with mental illness. And then the anguish of after these people were kind of recovered from a medical point of view, them returning to homelessness in the community, and then starting that cycle again, and how difficult that must be for a professional. You just take a walk today through the downtown east side of Vancouver, which was represented with such incredible power by my friend Libby Davies for so long, and you will confront that grim and tragic reality, which is particularly acute there for First Nations people. So, as an MP, I would give many speeches in which I underscored the reality that the greatest barriers to equality and acceptance facing gay and lesbian people were invisibility and silence. People afraid to be open because of the stigma and stereotyping. And that was why I made the decision back in 1988 to come out as the first openly gay MP in Canada, to help break that silence and put a human face on the lives of gay people, to say that we are truly everywhere, in your neighborhoods, your communities, your families, your workplaces, and yes, in your parliament too. But I want to say, I was not, in fact, the first out gay elected official in British Columbia. A lot of people thought it was. But in fact, that distinction belongs to a real pioneer of LGBT rights right here in the Comox Valley. My old friend, the late Jim Egan. Jim was a trailblazer for many years, an inspiration to me, certainly. He was an elected representative. He was an elected representative on the Comox Strathcona Regional District from 1981 to 1993. He was a founder of the Island Gay Society and the North Island AIDS Coalition in the mid-'80s, and you can appreciate at that time the many challenges that he faced, but an amazing leader. It was Jim and his partner Jack Nesbitt who took their battle for recognition of their relationship to the Supreme Court of Canada. And Iona mentioned this decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in 1995, which actually affirmed that sexual orientation was to be read in to the Charter of Rights. It was Jim Egan that took that case to the Supreme Court of Canada and won that really important victory. And boy, it was a sweet one. I remember talking to him afterwards, and first he thought he'd lost because they actually were trying to get recognition for their pension benefits, and the court, by a 5-4 majority, the court turned them down. And so he thought he'd lost, and I said, well, hold on, you may have lost that particular battle, Jim, but you won an incredible victory for the whole country to recognize that our charter includes sexual orientation. I had moved an amendment to include it explicitly in 1981, and it was defeated by a vote of 22-2. It wasn't even close, right? But here it was, and you should know in the Comox Valley that this was a really historic victory. Jim and Jack were heroes, and I hope that someday they will be honored and recognized as such here in the Comox Valley for their leadership. So today, 17 years later, or a lot of years later, Canada is a more progressive country in celebrating our diversity for LGBT people. What made this progress, for sure, and just let me say as well, on that, picking up the newspaper this morning and seeing the first kiss, how many saw that in the newspaper? It would have been, remarkable. And Andrew, I was so pleased to hear Andrew, the acting wing commander here, saying, things have changed. Things have changed in the Canadian military, right? And we recognize that love doesn't have those borders. It was a really amazing thing to see. I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime. Boy, that's for sure. But what really made the difference in the progress on LGBT rights was people getting to know us as people, not as feared, stigmatized abstractions or threats to their children or the community. And I think this is one of the keys to overcoming stigma and discrimination facing people living with mental illness as well. Study after study has shown that those who know people in their own lives, their family or their friends who are living with mental illness are far more understanding and accepting of the need to provide support and resources for mental illness. While I was able to come out in 1988 as the first openly gay MP, there has actually only been one MP in our history who's come out as living with mental illness. And that was the former Conservative Member of Parliament from Saskatchewan, Dave Batters, who announced in September of 2008, wasn't that long ago, that he would not be seeking re-election due to his struggle with depression. I was living in France at the time, and I heard about this, and I sent him a message, a letter, just sort of, encouraging him to stay strong and wishing him healing and talking about some of the challenges that I had faced and offering any assistance that I could provide. 6 months later, Dave Batters committed suicide. He killed himself at the age of 39. His widow, Denise, was actually appointed to the Senate just a couple of years ago and is a strong advocate on the rights of people living with mental illness. So there's still that incredibly strong stigma and discrimination. Many of us know people who've overcome huge challenges with physical disability. The former MP, Stephen Fletcher, just has made amazing progress. But because of this stigma around mental illness, particularly for those in public life, there's still too often just a deafening silence. But it's not easy to take that step for anybody, let alone in public life. It certainly wasn't easy for me when I was first being interviewed, for example, after April of 2004 by Evan Solomon on his program on national television. I talked about confronting my demons. That was about as far as I could push the envelope. And he asked me privately, well, will you be able to talk more? I said, I don't know. I don't want this to be the lens that people view me through forever, the only lens, when I've been involved in a lot of other things as well. But then I realized I was voicing the same kind of doubts and fears that I had before I came out as a gay man. And I'd overcome that. So I thought, well, okay, and in fact, didn't just overcome it, but for those of you that have taken that step, it was the most personally liberating experience of my life. So I thought, yeah, maybe I can do this. But then a few months later, I gave another speech. It was in Nova Scotia to some mental health awards, and I talked about living with a mood disorder. And I thought that was pretty clear. But the Globe and Mail wrote an editorial saying the former MP is not breaking new ground when he only says that he suffers from a mood disorder, an umbrella term for a wide range of illnesses. He may be reinforcing the stigma by refusing to be more specific. If the goal is to dispel stigma, Mr. Robinson will be as open with Canadians as he was in 1988. Well, I was kind of angry when I read that first. But then I thought, you know what? They're right. They're right. I mean, I may have been breaking new ground, but the fact of the matter is that I then went on to speak at another occasion. It was a CMHA event in Vancouver, and I spoke for the first time about living with bipolar disorder. I explained that fortunately I had been diagnosed with a comparatively mild form of the disorder called hypomania. There was, I might add, no follow-up editorial by the Globe and Mail lauding me for my candor in disclosing that. I'm still waiting. But so why did it take me so long to recognize that I was living with mental illness myself? You see, until that fateful day, it was Good Friday, April of 2004, I didn't know. I wasn't aware. In retrospect, I should have figured it out a long time ago. All the signs were there. A significant family history of mental illness in close family members, my aunt, my dad, my mom, who tragically ended her life at the age of 47, and others. Behavioral warning signals that increased in intensity, especially after that traumatic hiking accident that some of you will remember that I had on Geriatric Island in late 1997. It left me in a wheelchair for 3 months with my jaw wired shut. And any of you that know me can imagine how difficult that was, especially when Alexa McDonough went to my surgeon and asked if it could be permanently wired shut. Fortunately, she wasn't successful. Actually, it was an all-party delegation that went to I mean, the signs were all there. I was getting 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night. My dentist was telling me I was grinding my teeth so badly I needed a mouth guard, rushing around here and there with increasing intensity around the world, back home to Burnaby, outdoor knocking in my riding, manic, manic, manic. Close friends and my partner, Max, were pleading with me to slow down, to get help, all of which culminated in that self-destructive and utterly irrational act of stealing a ring on Good Friday in 2004. But as is often the case with people living with bipolar, in many ways, I didn't have to confront it because I was also very successful. And in some ways, it actually contributed to my ability to accomplish so much. I remember one of my colleagues asking me, how was it I was able to get around to 11 different churches in one day to celebrate Christmas one year? I mean, and I didn't really understand it. I mean, now I understand. I'd won elections, was well known, and had a partner I loved. I was flying high. But that hiking accident in '97 had clearly left some scars. And I'd so internalized the stigma that I was in denial about my own reality. I was Svend Robinson. I was invulnerable, invincible. But my world may have come crashing down that Good Friday. But at the same time, as my legal counsel, Clayton Ruby, so perceptively noted later, it was a cry for help. It was a cry for help that probably, almost certainly in fact, saved my life and my relationship. The days afterward are still a bit of a blur, but what got me through that terrible time was the support of people just across the board, from across the country, my family, my amazing partner Max, my leader Jack Layton, caucus colleagues, especially Libby, my constituents, people across the political spectrum, and so many people who just wrote or phoned or emailed or stopped me in the store. That's what really pulled through. And the other thing you should never underestimate on the road to recovery is the power of dogs' unconditional love. Our two Havanese pups, Jasmine and Cohiba, with their sloppy kisses and affection, really did make a difference, let me tell you. Of course, what happened was also a gift to my political foes. I don't have to elaborate on that. It was like red meat, right? And I mean, knowing that I was the author of my own fate made it even worse, even harder to deal with. The cartoons, the social media, letters to the editor, and so on. Max was great. He tried to support me as best he could with humor. For example, when some of the cartoons caricatured me as the Lord of the Rings, he put a picture of Gollum on the fridge and referred to me as my precious. It's true. But it was not easy. My natural reaction was to hide, to lay low. We moved our home, and I didn't participate in public activities for many months. I was very fortunate, though, to be able to go to work right away in a new job with the labor movement, with the BCGEU, that I really enjoyed, and that made a big difference. I always made it clear in responding that I accepted full responsibility for my actions and was very fortunate that a wise and compassionate judge sentenced me to a discharge, which means that I have no criminal record. Beverly McLaughlin highlighted in her brilliant lecture last year that criminal sentencing is one of the most important and difficult tasks of a judge. She noted that the judge hears passionate views from the community and must consider the impact on both the offender and the community. She noted that the voices of retribution often are much louder than those calling for healing and restorative justice. And that was certainly the case in the media for me. But despite that, Judge Fratkin, who heard my case, handed down a sentence that was both wise and just, a conditional discharge with community work service and an order to pursue psychiatric assistance. Indeed, both the Crown and my lawyer agreed on the circumstances that led to those events. In Judge Fratkin's decision, after listening to what he described as a gut-wrenching tale and hearing the submissions of my lawyer and the Crown, by the way, was yet another special prosecutor who was appointed by the Attorney General of British Columbia. I kept them busy. But after he heard from the lawyers, he said this. He said, the public, at least in Canada, I think, has always lived by the sort of guiding principle. You don't kick somebody when they're down. Mr. Robinson's down. I do not think we need to kick him by convicting him, so there will be a conditional discharge. And in fact, in terms of restorative justice, this was a compassionate and just decision. I had immediately apologized, both publicly and privately, to the auction service who had the ring on consignment, and they had accepted that, by the way, and they had, and this is not sort of public record, but they'd said that to the police that they didn't see any point in pursuing criminal action, but that was the decision that was made by the special prosecutor. There was great community understanding, and certainly the judge in not sending me to jail, and that was the call by many right-wing media commentators, by the way, the judge, I think, really took an action that was clearly in not only the community's best interest, but my best interests. I had wonderful letters of support from many different people from across the political spectrum again, and I did 100 hours of community work service, working with injured birds and animals at the Burnaby Wildlife Rescue, which was a great experience. And of course I pursued the counseling as the judge ordered. And that's what got me into the office of a therapist for the first time in my life, was that experience, that terrible experience that I went through. And I couldn't cross the threshold. My image of psychiatry was sort of one flew over the cuckoo's nest, right? And it just was unthinkable to me that I would experience that. And then there was the issue of medication, drugs and medication. That was a real struggle for me. I couldn't imagine taking pills. Bad enough to be seeing a shrink, but taking pills as well? No. And it wasn't until my doctor, a very gifted doctor, Dr. Friedman, asked me a question. He said, well, if you had a chemical imbalance that affected your liver or your kidney or your heart, would you hesitate to take medication that might help to deal with that? I said, no, of course not. Well, what's the difference? Right? And so I understood that. I'm fortunate. I don't need those medications any longer, but I'm comforted by the knowledge that it's there if I do. Certainly 1 or 2 times, Max has gently suggested it might not be a bad idea. Manic, 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 that's the mantra. But my therapist, basically with insight, wisdom, and compassion, was life-sustaining. And without the love and support of my partner, it's been 22 years, I know I wouldn't have gotten through it. So I did what I could in the years after April 2004 until we left for Europe in 2007 to try to make a difference in the public's understanding of mental illness. Just as I put a human face on being gay, I hope to be able to, in a small way, to do what I could to help to ease the pain, the stigma, and the discrimination that face too many people living with mental illness in Canada. There have been lots of challenges on this journey. One of the biggest, actually, has been to make it crystal clear that there is no direct link between mental illness and crime, whether violent crime or theft. I took full responsibility for my own actions. I didn't use mental illness as a crutch or as an excuse. Did it help to explain what led to this irrational, totally out of character act? Yes, of course it did, as I noted earlier. Explain, but not excuse. That was an important distinction, to take responsibility. So in the time remaining, I want to try to understand and share my sense of what are the lessons that can be learned from a restorative justice perspective from my journey. Because I believe that the principles of restorative justice can be a powerful, compassionate, and effective response to many, not all, but many of the challenges that face people living with mental illness who commit criminal acts, to their victims and to the communities in which they live. The Chief Justice last year spoke of the task of restorative justice as being, in her words, to heal the breach with the community and heal the breach with the victim, so the unity of the circle can be restored. She noted this is often a very difficult process and that scar tissue often remains. God knows I can attest to that. The challenge in dealing with offenders with mental illness is that we're not seeking to restore an offender's mental health. We're actually, in many cases, seeking to change the person and to bring them into a state of health from a state of illness in which they originally found themselves. We're seeking healing, and in some cases, we're looking for profound transformation and change. As Darren Blaney from the Homolka First Nation in this area so eloquently noted last year during the question and answer session after the Chief Justice's lecture, in his words, he said the key goal of restorative justice is what he called making it right. Making it right. And I was struck, John, by by your words when you said, you know, we're coming together to make things right. To make things right. The goal of restorative justice. Those words are really powerful. He spoke of the trauma of First Nations survivors of the residential school experience and noted that we have to make it right. And the recent report of the Commission was so clear on this as well, with treatment which is too often lacking or non-existent. Otherwise, as he pointed out, they just keep recycling through the system. And we all know how First Nations people are hugely, disproportionately represented in our jails and prisons, especially First Nations women. I couldn't believe it when, as justice critic, I went to the Prison for Women in Kingston, Ontario, and the number of First Nations women, Aboriginal women, it was over 2/3 of all the women in that prison, imagine, were First Nations women. And that's repeated in many provincial institutions as well. As the National Mental Health Commission in their 2012 strategy document referred to prisons and jails as the asylums of the 21st century. Howard Zerr, who is one of the pioneer academics who writes on restorative justice, has noted that one of the most important processes of restorative justice is the concept of healing, or what he calls the collaborative unburdening of pain for the victim, the offender, and the community. He goes on to underline the groups that have made the most specific and profound contribution to these efforts. He's an American academic. And he said the groups that have made the greatest contribution, in fact, are First Nations people in Canada and the United States and the Maori of New Zealand. He also highlights the major role of Mennonites in popularizing the principles of restorative justice. And I remember well working with the Mennonite leadership in the 80s when I was justice critic. They were wonderful to work with in terms of their vision. And Iona, I think I see you nodding. You'll recall that real wisdom that they had. And it was such a blessing to be able to work with them, along with abolitionists like the late, great Claire Culhane. I hope some of you remember Claire and the wonderful work that she did. So how does society respond to offenders with mental illness whose crimes are driven by their mental illness? And how do the principles of restorative justice apply here? We know that 25 to 40% of people with mental illness, this is extraordinary, come into contact with the criminal justice system each year. 1 out of every 5 prisoners, at least, are dealing with mental illness. I remember so well being told by prisoners when I was justice critic that the 3 groups of prisoners who were the lowest of the low in the prison hierarchy were the goofs, the rats, and the skinners. Those with mental illness were lumped in with the informers and the sexual offenders, and too often they were subjected to yet further abuse within the prisons. And then they would get no meaningful treatment, leave prison in some cases more sick and more vulnerable than when they came in. The task of restorative justice is surely to seek to intervene at a much earlier stage to ensure that the underlying mental disorders are treated and dealt with. But applying traditional restorative justice principles will not always be easy or even possible in dealing with offenders with mental illness. For example, persons with mental illness may require special assistance to feel remorse for criminal behaviors and empathy for their victims. They may be less culpable for criminal behavior because of impaired ability to appreciate the nature or consequences of their acts, or to appreciate that their behaviors were wrong. Several mental disorders present particular challenges to the restorative justice paradigm. For example, psychopathy. Offenders present as superficial, lacking empathy, compulsive liars, deflecting responsibility, or offenders with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. Challenges with anger management, aggression, antisocial personalities. Both of these can be really high in young offenders, with estimates as high as 40% in some studies. And because empathy and understanding are so vital to the success of restorative justice session, while they have little relevance to the traditional retributive model, restorative justice may not be possible in those cases. I did read a very interesting recent study here in the Comox Valley by Larry Winter, I'm not sure if Larry's here tonight, which pointed to a positive outcome with young people aged 14 to 16 in completing resolution agreements. And that there's been a big spike recently here in the Valley that the CJC has noted in cases involving people with mental disabilities and I believe addictions as well. I hope that his recommendations to the Vancouver Island Region Restorative Justice Association will be taken seriously. It seems to me, in looking at this issue of offenders with mental illness, that the key to success in participating in restorative justice is that they must have sufficient understanding of the nature of their offense and its impact on the victim, as well as the interpersonal skills to engage in a meaningful dialogue with the victim. They have to understand the impact of their offense on the community. And victims may have to be educated as part of this circle and this dialogue as to the nature and impact of mental illness on the offender. And of course, the participation of both must be totally voluntary. And finally, because of mental disorder can affect the interaction between the parties to restorative justice, it's important that the facilitator of the session also be specially trained to understand how to deal with offenders with mental illness. And let me add that resources are just so absolutely critical to addressing the nexus between mental illness and crime. And here Canada falls far short. We spend only about 7 cents of every health dollar on mental health, which is far lower than many, many other countries. We've got to do a lot better job. Only 15% of young people with mental health problems have access to services they need. 15%. That means 85% of young people with mental health issues don't have access to the services that they need and the treatment and support that they need. This is, in fact, a time for restorative justice of great challenge and great opportunity to make it a real priority. There have been a number of encouraging developments over the past few years that have given me hope that things will finally get better. Roy Romano, in his landmark report on Canada's healthcare system, highlighted the importance of recognizing mental health as the orphan child of the healthcare system and made a number of important other recommendations. The Senate Committee on Social Affairs, chaired by Michael Kirby, handed down a landmark report on mental health and mental illness called Out of the Shadows in 2006. And they recommended the establishment of a National Mental Health Commission and called for us to finally implement a national mental health strategy. The good news is that the commission was established the following year in 2007 under the gifted leadership of Michael Wilson, my former parliamentary colleague and the former Minister of Finance, whose own son committed suicide. And Michael still chairs that commission. They released a landmark national mental health strategy in 2012 called Changing Directions, Changing Lives, and with a number of important recommendations. And I'm not going to take the time to go through them now, but I would urge you to have a serious look at those recommendations that they made, because they really went to the core of many of the fundamental principles of restorative justice. And there's a whole chapter on mental illness, mental health, and restorative justice and the criminal justice system. Most recently, in fact, just a couple of months ago, a provincial government took a major step forward on restorative justice. It was the New Democrat government in Manitoba that tabled a Restorative Justice Act. And in proclaiming the new legislation, the Attorney General said, through a strong restorative justice system, we can help reduce future crimes, provide closure to victims, and reduce some of the pressures on the traditional court system. It's an exciting new act. It creates a broad-based advisory council with community and government representatives of people living with mental illness, to oversee the implementation of a 5-year restorative justice plan. There's new funding for mental health and addictions, and it creates 5 regional restorative justice hubs, recognizing the particular challenges of rural communities as well. Another really encouraging development is the promise of new Prime Minister Trudeau and his government to significantly increase resources for mental health. That's a really important promise that has been made. And in concrete terms, I was delighted to see that for the first time ever, the mandate letter that was given to the new Minister of Justice, Jody Wilson-Raybould, and what a historic appointment that was, the first Aboriginal woman, Minister of Justice of Canada, as one of a cabinet of 50% women, because hey, it's 2015. It was pretty exciting. And Justin actually released, and again, this is the first time that this has ever happened again, he released the mandate letters. What were the tasks of these ministers? And included in the mandate letter for the Minister of Justice, he made specific reference to restorative justice. He called for the increased use of restorative justice processes. And the mandate letter also called for collaboration with other ministers to, quote, address gaps in services to Aboriginal people and those with mental illness through the criminal justice system and restorative justice. When did we last hear those words from a Prime Minister of Canada? Very heartening and very encouraging. So these are exciting and hopeful times for long overdue leadership in this area. And the task now for elected representatives at all levels, I might add. And I'm so pleased to see a number of elected representatives here from local government. As a federal member of Parliament, I often thought that you were the unsung heroes. I mean, I could escape to Ottawa, right? But boy, if you're on the front lines in a local community, you can't go anywhere, right? It's not an easy form, and hats off to you. But at the same time, this support for restorative justice has got to have that buy-in, that solid support at the community level, as well as at the provincial level, the territorial level, and the national level. And of course, another thing that gives me such hope is that we are so blessed here in Canada with the remarkable visionary leadership of our Supreme Court, headed by the Chief Justice Beverley McLachlin. I mean, you can't begin to imagine what a difference this makes. You get just a taste of it by looking at all the controversy around the appointment of the next Supreme Court Justice in the United States, right? But we are so privileged, and we take it for granted. I mean, we really do. Those justices have ensured that the words of the Charter of Rights are not just words, but they're powerful tools to advance towards justice and equality, including the fundamental principles of restorative justice. Indeed, one of the questions that Chief Justice McLachlin was asked at last year's lecture was about the destructive impact of mandatory minimum sentences in the criminal justice system. And those of you that were here will recall she deferred answering that question because she said that there was a case coming before her court on that very issue. Well, just 2 months after she spoke here, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Regina versus Noor. Her court, with her writing the eloquent majority judgment, 5-4, but she was in the majority, struck down those laws and restored judicial discretion in sentencing. A really important decision at the heart of restorative justice principles. So in closing, let me just again thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share something of my journey with you this evening, to pay tribute again to this remarkable leader in our country, to my friend Iona, and to the visionary leadership of the Community Justice Centre here in the Comox Valley. I am a great fan of Leonard Cohen. Still going strong, over 80 years old, just like Iona, strong and powerful in his early 80s. And Leonard Cohen, in one of his songs, had these lyrics. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. That's how the light gets in. And for me, from the pain and the anguish and the bewilderment of that crack on Good Friday in 2004, finally, the light did get in. And our goal I profoundly believe, as passionate advocates and believers in restorative justice, must surely be to seek that light, that hope, that healing for all offenders who are living with mental illness, for their families, for their victims, and for their communities. I thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much.
Private health care awaits.
Oh my God. Good for you. Thank you so much, Iona.
That was wonderful.
Thank you so much for doing that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Iona.
As a restorative justice organization, I noticed that the podium has slipped a little to the left, so I will restore some balance.
I can't help it.
I now want to call upon Jerry Bemister, a member of the Iona Campagnola Lectures Committee, to receive the talking stick through which you may ask questions of Svend and to ultimately extend our thanks to him.
Can you all hear me? Yeah. All right. Svend, I'd really like to say, before we get into the question and answer period, on behalf of North Island College and the CJC, thank you for that truly inspiring, heartfelt presentation. As an advocate myself, outside of my work here at North Island College, it's leaders like Iona and yourself that inspire me to go when the pain gets hard, inspire me to keep on going when the opposition is hard at you. So thank you very much. All right, so just like my classroom, I guess we'll do a show of hands if you have a question, and I'll come around and give you the microphone. Questions for Svend tonight? Oh, come on. My class does this too. Okay.
Hello, Svend. Thank you. You're looking as good and sounding as good as they can be, so thank you for, yes. I think that we are all cracked, and that we all have like mental illness, and I'm not meaning to be sarcastic or diminishing, but I am really hoping that a part of the recommendations for mental illness are things like naps and things to just bring us down from the stress, because that's what, you know, seems to kick it all in. You know, so I'm hoping that, what did you say that the name of the, like where we could find out about those recommendations for?
It's the Mental Health Commission of Canada. They have a website, and it's just, if you Google Mental Health Commission, their report was a 2012 report, and it was a really powerful, good report.
Yeah, well, it's good to hear that things are getting institutionalized. Common sense, I'm hoping too. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, anybody else?
Hello. I really enjoyed your lecture tonight. It really hit home for me. I've also too suffered from mental illness, depression, and I won't go into my personal story, but what when it was happening to me at the time, what I found was really, really difficult, like the stigma and everything else, but also the lack of education, for example, with my employer, and that was really difficult. And I also want to say the other thing that was really difficult was the lack of resources. especially for people that don't have the means. Counseling, for example, costs money. If you don't have the money, you don't get counseling. And, when you lose your job, you lose your home, and you become homeless. I just wanted to, maybe if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and certainly the Commission highlighted that probably the greatest challenge facing people with living with mental illness is poverty and homelessness. I mentioned earlier the fact that even if you're fortunate enough to have treatment, if when you leave that treatment you have no home to go to and you have a dysfunctional environment, then you can't live any kind of a decent life. So it is absolutely a question of resources. One of the first lessons I learned in politics was, politics is about priorities. And the priority that at least so far traditionally has been given to mental health within the overall healthcare system has been abysmally low. I mentioned the resources, 7 cents out of every dollar. Whereas comparable countries, it's at least 10, 12 cents out of every dollar. I'm hopeful that the new government will be prepared to put resources in, but it's going to depend on effective advocacy. I know that, for example, in this community, I'm confident that both Rachel and Gord, for example, they're new members of Parliament, but boy, they're off to a great start. I'm sure they're going to be tough and effective advocates, but make sure that they hear from you about these issues as well.
I actually don't traditionally need a microphone. I project. Just a couple things. I wanted to thank you. You have no idea the impact of your words personally to me this evening. And I just, a number of months ago, I said to my partner, I said, that's a man I wish I could talk to. And when your name came up to be here tonight, I just, again, thank you for that. I just am curious your thoughts on the medical establishment, the traditional medical establishment that is so quick to prescribe medication versus, as was mentioned here, counseling or alternative methods of treatment. It just seems that it's a pill for this, it's a pill for this, it's a pill for that. And I was just wondering your thoughts on that and how far do we have to go before we start to see that change, or what steps do we take to see that change as well?
Yeah, thank you for your words, and it's a great question. And it gets partly into the political realm and the power of Big Pharma, to be very blunt. I was health critic for the party for a number of years, and the power of that lobby was incredible. There's a lot of money to be made. Big Pharma is one of the most profitable businesses in the world. I now work at the international level with the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. We're the biggest purchasers in the world of medications for HIV, AIDS, malaria, and TB. 95% of what we buy as generics from India. But there's huge pressure from the brand name companies. And I think that I say that because I think that's part of the challenge here. It's too easy. And I mean, fortunately there's some restrictions now on doctors being wined and dined and sent off on wonderful holidays and so on by pharmaceutical companies. But they have a lot of power. And sometimes it's just too easy to prescribe medication as opposed to looking at other alternatives. I don't know an awful lot about geriatric psychiatry, and I don't know if Natasha's here, but I'd be interested to hear from her because one of the first things that I did as a teenager was to volunteer in an old folks' home, a seniors' home, Napier Personal Care Home in Vancouver. And I just remember being struck by how there were these little paper cups full of drugs, and they would take them in the morning, and they would take them at lunch, and they would take them in the evening, and most of the time they were just zombies, right? And it was no way to live. In some cases, obviously in some cases, those medicines are incredibly important and life-sustaining. But I think that the point you make is an excellent one, that we really have to be much more open to other alternatives. And as part of that, I think we've got to be prepared to challenge, in some cases, the power of Big Pharma.
Thank you, Svend, very much. I want to go back to the issue about the Canadian Mental Health Commission. The report was in 2012. We didn't hear much about it at the time. We certainly didn't hear anything about it in the most recent federal election. When I began my work career 28 years ago, we were talking about the absence of funding for mental health, particularly in minority communities, and we're still talking about it. What do we need to do as citizens to bump this up to the priority level that it will in fact get significant funding and recognition for politicians? You were one. What would have worked if you were being lobbied by people like us wanting to get better attention to the dire situation of people living with mental health difficulties?
Yeah, and again, just another great question. I mean, I think there's a couple of things that might work, and I'm drawing here now on my experience as an advocate in a number of other areas. And one, you might be surprised to hear me suggest this, one may very well be a court challenge, you know? Because the sad reality is that too often politicians have not led on these issues, but, you know, they've been forced to do it. The court made me do it. I had no choice. That was the case on sexual orientation in the in human rights legislation. It was the case on equal marriage rights. It was the case in a number of other really important issues. And sometimes politicians will almost welcome being able to hide behind the courts and say, well, you know, secretly they might even support the change, but if it's kind of controversial. I mean, one of the most bewildering for me was the whole issue of dying with dignity. I mean, the public overwhelmingly, over 80%, time and again, the polls have shown that the public supports this change, with proper safeguards to be sure, with quality palliative care to be sure, with respect for the rights of people with disabilities to be sure. But, you know, having said that, so I think that one potential strategy, and look at abortion. I mean, I mentioned earlier, Iona and I were very actively involved in that issue in the early 80s. I was sitting beside Henry Morgenthaler in the Supreme Court in January 1989 when we got that remarkable decision. But it was the courts, right? So I'm going on a bit here, but it may very well be that it will take a court challenge under the Constitution, the Charter, because it includes mental disability, to force politicians to take this seriously. That's one, but the other one is visibility. And it's one of the great difficulties in this domain, because how many people are prepared to meet with their member of parliament and say, you know, I'm a person living with mental illness, or my daughter, or my son, my sister, my brother. Not many people are prepared to do that, what that courageous young man did in my office, right? And I have to say, I mean, I plead guilty too. I thought it was a pretty progressive guy, you know, out there on a lot of issues. Until Matt came into my office, I hadn't really understood how important it was that we make this visible. So that would be the other bit of advice I would give you, is to the extent that you're able to, whether it's, you know, yourself or on behalf of other people, make sure that those elected representatives at all levels hear your voices and make it human, make it real.
Svend, I was one of those people who remember very clearly your day of reckoning in April of 2004. And I had many an argument over you in those days, and I'm so glad I was on your side, because a few years later, my world went black, and I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And to follow up what the gentleman said about medical doctors, I have found over the years that most are completely dismissive of mental illness or want to give a pill. But most of them completely and utterly do not really recognize mental illness as something that they should be dealing with. And in fact, this is the first doctor that I have ever had here on the island who, when read through my medical form, was the first thing she asked was, can you tell me about the PTSD? And this is like 15 years later. Yeah. So what do we do to educate people in our community and have them understand?
Yeah, these are hard questions. And such good questions. I mean, I guess part of my answer would be, let's look at how doctors are trained, right? I suspect that's part of the problem. I'm not an expert at all. When I was a student senator at UBC in those days with Evie and Bruce and others, I actually represented medical students, and I tried to understand, but I think education and awareness is really important, because I can imagine for a doctor that it's not always easy to deal with a really complex and difficult thing, and the temptation would be probably just to say, well, here, take another pill, right? There are a lot of dedicated doctors out there, for sure. I mean, I was fortunate in the doctor that I had, who spent a lot of time with me and helped me to understand, and didn't push the medication. But I think probably if I had to pinpoint one area, it would be education, both of medical students, but also, very importantly, continuing education for the medical profession as things change, so that they can become more aware of how to be more responsive and more respectful of people like you.
Hi, Svend. Thank you. I grew up in the Lower Mainland in Surrey, and my father was a psychiatric nurse at the Woodland School for his career. And we used to visit him as children every Christmas and sing carols and visit the ward. And we thought it was a pretty weird thing to do, but we always got pleasure out of it, of course. And I've always recognized that I've been mentally ill, and I've learned to use it as an advantage. So I'm okay. Seriously, seeing the Woodland School shut down and institutions like the Cuckoo's Nest that we saw Hollywood's portrayal of, it occurs to me that in that day and age, the basket of mentally ill had a home. They had a place to go to. While the treatment may not have been best, and we need to evolve from that kind of treatment, the dying of the institutions have put these people on the street. They don't have a home now. We meant for them to go into the community and have community homes. That hasn't really worked out that well, because when the community home has a birth and they fall out of there, there's no institution to catch them. That's why they're on the street. We need to give these people homes. All of these ideas about treating mental health and retraining doctors, that's a great holistic long-term view. That won't help the kids on the street in Powell River and Slam and Burnaby tomorrow. We need to give them homes today. Then we can work on their mental illness. First, they need a home.
And of course, you're so right. I mean, people forget Riverview. I mean, you mentioned Woodlands, but Riverview, there were 40,000 people that basically went through Riverview, and then that was shut down, and the theory was, as you say, quite rightly, that they would be kind of integrated into the community and there'd be community supports, but it didn't happen. So they're on the streets and homeless. You're absolutely right.
Hello. I'm up here. I'm up here. Thank you for this fascinating and very true lecture. I'm a nurse and mental health and addictions therapist here in the Comox Valley, and I work in the area of homelessness and clinically with people who are homeless. So I want to echo this gentleman. We know that the solution is the housing. We've seen the difference. In the Comox Valley, we haven't had any new net rental housing for over 20 years. So, hence our problem with homelessness. I just wanted to offer an opportunity for people to do some advocacy. Rachel Blaney right now is doing some pre-budget consultation, and you can send in some suggestions as to the funding and ask for funding for mental health. And tomorrow is the deadline. So, yeah, February 26th. I know, but I mean, at least, if 15, 20 or more people this evening or tomorrow morning do that, it would be wonderful. I think if we hear from more constituents, perhaps we can get some action. So,
no, it's a great idea. And the budget date is actually the 22nd of March, so you do have a bit of time to have some input. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Sven. a good definition of mental illness is to keep on doing the same thing while expecting different outcomes. Now, if the aim of police forces, RCMP, provincial, whatever, is to gain the support and respect and love of their communities, a good way to go about it is to go out and kill or maim unarmed civilians. And this happens. I've got a friend who works locally in a police force, and he says they're lovely fellows in the housing they have. They like hockey, they joke with each other, great buddies. Then they go out on the street and it's Jekyll and Hyde. They're authoritarian, they're aggressive, they're violent. Your words. You were painting a caricature of mental illness, but they were your words, and this does happen with some police officers. Question: would you recommend, perhaps, that police officers, maybe towards the end of their training, take part in healing circles?
Yes. Sure. I mean, I think we have to be very careful not to stereotype any profession, and you know, I think you would agree. But certainly, I think as a principle, that law enforcement is an essential part of those healing circles. And I think, and I'm not an expert on restorative justice, I'm a passionate believer in restorative justice, but I think that police officers and law enforcement, Bruce, you can correct me if I'm wrong, are a really key component, and certainly as part of the Community Justice Center, are valued partners in this work.
Thank you, Svend. Over here.
Oh, okay.
This restorative justice is new to me, fairly new to me in my awareness. You spoke about awareness and education, and I've had the fortune to actually be living with Larry Winter that you quoted earlier. So my learning curve has been fast. In this awareness, I just wondered if you would comment on global and social media. I noticed you've talked Canadian and community, which is why you're here. But I noticed the Princess Kate was advocating for mental illness. You live in Europe, and I just wondered if you would comment on the global groundswell of this awareness of restorative justice.
I wish I could comment on a global groundswell. I have seen individuals who have spoken out eloquently and powerfully. You mentioned Kate. Actually, Prince Harry has been doing some really important work on the issue of soldiers returning with great trauma in many cases. And there have been a number of other individuals, but sadly, I have to say I haven't seen sort of a big difference in Europe in its approach to mental illness compared to our approach here. There are some exceptions. I know, for example, some of the countries, Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands in particular, that really have a lot more emphasis, a lot more focus, and most importantly, number one priority for them, I know this, and it comes back to the gentleman, he's left now, and others who've said it, is housing. Just decent quality housing. And that has been the top priority for some of them, and it's made a huge difference. I've seen that. My aunt Karen, who lived for many years with mental illness, was really fortunate to have that kind of support of a healing community, and great attention in Denmark. So there are some countries in which they've made some progress. There's some individuals, but overall, I have to say I haven't seen any kind of significant recognition of the importance of moving in this area. One area where they are way ahead of us is in incarceration, the levels of incarceration and sentencing. They're light years ahead of us in that area.
I don't know if I have a question as much as I have a comment, but I would like to say thank you. I work in the school system. I've worked in the school system for 35 years. I spent today learning a new curriculum that's being implemented by our government, and one of the new outcomes is for emotional health, emotional learning, mental health. And it's like so many things. I mean, it's education. It's like when you talk about gay rights, it's when you talk about the Aboriginal, it's about learning, it's about the level of awareness. When I was doing my master's degree and did my thesis on sexual abuse in the 80s, no one had heard about it. Now it's out there. But mental health has to start in our families. And, you know, we talk about mental illness, but we have to talk about mental health and what is mental health. And how do we recognize mental health? I mean, yes, you're always going to have mental illness because some of those, I think, are just the biological, the way we're wired. But a lot of mental illness comes from lack of mental health. And it's being aware, it's getting out there, it's fighting for the funding. It's the funding that we need. It's the funding for these programs. It's like last week, I'm sure many of you participated in the coldest time of the year walk, right? It's getting the homeless off the street. And we can come, we can listen, and we can say thank you, but we need to get out there and we need to say we need the funding. We need the funding for the children, we need the funding for our families, we need the funding for our mental health.
Bruce, do we have time for one more question?
Do it.
Okay, so I didn't come from India from here.
One more.
Okay.
Come on.
Maybe a comment just in closing, Sven. Wanted to say that many of your comments today made me proud to be a Canadian. Your honesty, your reference to the court decisions, and in particular your acknowledgement of Iona Campagnola, a member of another political party, and your references to members of other political parties and the empathy shown and that came back to you makes me proud to be a Canadian. We're getting an example south of the border where there's members of the same political party that can't be civil and kind to each other. I think that bodes well for our system. We're all in this together, and we all need to work together and agree to disagree with civility and respect and dignity as you've shown throughout your career. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
On April the 18th, 2004, which is very close to the date you might remember that Svend mentioned, at the presentation of Svend's Lifetime Achievement Award, film producer and Emily Carr University of Art and Design professor Erlyn Weisman said, "Heroes aren't people who are perfect. Heroes aren't infallible. Heroes aren't unreachable icons who somehow different from the rest of us. Heroes are people who stand up and speak out and do the hard work to face the fears that we all have when we do things that are hard. But they do it anyway, and they sometimes pay a very personal price. Svend Robinson is a hero. He will always be a hero to me, because it isn't that heroes never fail in their goals. It's that they never fail in trying to achieve them. Heroes are human. They make mistakes, they get scared, and they need support, just as we all do. And I want to thank Svend for coming out again. Thank you so much for joining us for the Campagnola lecture this evening. It's been delightful to see so many individuals expressing their interest in the Community Justice Center's work for restorative justice in the Comox Valley. And thank you, Svend, for traveling here from Europe and bringing your thoughts on these issues to our attention, and more importantly, to our thinking. Next year, the lecture featuring the Right Honourable Adrian Clarkson and John Ralston Saul will be held a little later, sometimes in late April, early May. So be sure to watch for the announcement when it's made. It will be held in the Sid Williams Theatre, not the Stan Hagen Theatre, the Sid Williams Theatre downtown. And if this year's attendance is any measure, it will surely see the tickets going very rapidly indeed. One final announcement. Evelyn Gillespie and the Laughing Oyster Bookstore are selling copies of the biography of Svend Robinson out in the lobby. Svend has agreed to stay and chat and sign copies if anybody would like that. The proceeds from tonight's sale are being donated by Laughing Oyster Books to North Island College's Positive Space group, which is just started in January. And it's led by actually an intern from the Community Justice Center. But independent of that, we would have supported it anyway. For those of you who are not familiar with Positive Space, it's the name that the local group on campus has chosen. Others may know it as similar to like a Gay Straight Alliance from high schools, or there are other support communities and groups where allies and LGBTQ people can come together to address their concerns, and Laughing Oyster Books wants to support that. They think it's a great idea. And congratulations to North Island College staff. So once again, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Svend, for coming, and we are thrilled.